Okay with everybody? There we go. Okay. Um, and so yeah, I'm really happy to have you all here tonight, and I'm incredibly honored to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. And our guest speaker, who is Jonathan Reitz, who is a wildlife biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. He's an incredibly humble guy, so I'm going to take particular pleasure in making him really uncomfortable by lavishing praise upon him here to start this meeting. For those of you who have not heard of Jonathan, Jonathan, I would describe him as sort of the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain of Split, especially in terms of all of our wildlife projects. He's been instrumental in helping us to grow our prairie dog acres and getting black-footed ferrets recovered and established on our Heartland Preserve. He's been involved in riparian restoration, helping us to find innovative ways to harvest and replant native willows and cottonwoods to restore some of the stream drainages in our preserves. The list goes on. I could talk for quite a long time about it. But I would like to start this webinar with a particular story. And that story starts actually about a month ago or maybe 6 weeks ago. With Jonathan at 3:30 in the morning in a pickup truck driving out to eastern Colorado to see one of these amazing lesser prairie chicken leks. And for those of you who are not familiar with chickens or have not had the experience to see this majestic creature in action in the wild, it's one of the coolest things I think that I've ever seen, and probably one of the highlights of my year this year when I went out with Jonathan to sit on one of his leks, one of the only remaining leks in the state of Colorado, to see these chickens dance around and try to attract mates during the breeding season. So that story is a perfect intro into this talk. And tonight, Jonathan is going to discuss some of the research and work that he's done revolving around the lesser prairie chicken. He's going to talk about why they're one of the most endangered bird species in the Southern Plains. And he's going to talk hopefully a little bit about some of the efforts that we are working on and trying to collaborate on together right now to put together a generational stronghold for lesser prairie chickens in Southeast Colorado. The ultimate goal is to try to put together, somewhere around 50,000 acres of land that's protected and managed specifically for prairie chicken to provide them a long-term, perpetual future in the region. So, without further ado, I'll let Jonathan take it away. And Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet. Thanks, Henry. Good evening. It's great to have the opportunity to visit with you guys all about lesser prairie chickens, species that is right at the top of the list as far as critters that I care about. I've worked on lesser prairie chicken conservation for 20 years now. At least I've been around long enough that I can lie with confidence. Just forewarning, there's a little bit of thunderstorm here in Lamar right now, so who knows what might happen with that. So fingers crossed that connectivity maintains and all that good stuff. With that, go ahead and get started. And Henry, if you can let me know if that pulls up with a regular
Good. I
slide.
can see it just fine. Yep.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. So this evening we're really gonna take kind of a little bit of a deep dive into Colorado's lesser prairie chicken story, and even more so the story of the sand sage eco region. I'll explain what that means here in a little bit. But we're gonna just kind of paint the picture of where we were, what's happened to get us to where we are now, and where we're hoping to go here in the future. So I'll just give you a second to digest this slide here. This basically sums up pretty well, I guess my work and my my life. Um, so yeah, the sad reality is that that really is what I do far too much of. So I'm sure some of you can relate to that as well. I do get to get out in the field and do some fun things, but yeah. Okay, so the stars of the show today, the lesser prairie chicken. There on the right, we have a male lesser prairie chicken, and on the left, we have a female lesser prairie chicken. The male, you can distinguish them by they have, especially during the spring. They have really kind of inflated, large yellow eye combs that stand out. They have these large, dark clusters of feathers on their neck that kind of look a little bit like, kind of like devil horns, sort of. They're called pinnae, and they raise them up as part of the display when they're trying to press the girls. And then you can see a little glimpse of it in the picture there, but they have a red air sac that they inflate, and they make sounds, very distinctive sound that is very different from any other prairie grouse. And then the females also they have itty bitty pinnae and tiny, tiny ear eye combs, and they actually do have air sacs. And I've spent a ridiculous amount of time watching lesser prairie chickens. Probably spent about 2 years worth of my life's worth of mornings watching prairie chickens. And out of that time, I've only ever seen lesser prairie chicken hens sort of display or boom a couple of times. And that's only happened when there's been a big cluster of a whole bunch of lesser prairie chicken hens on a lek when they're getting after each other. But they do actually have air sacs and they will make some distinctive sounds. So very easy to distinguish a male versus a female. These birds are a species of the southern Great Plains. Sorry, it's taking a second for the slides to. So they're a species of the southern Great Plains. They're one of three extant or living prairie chickens. So the lesser prairie chicken, as you can see there on the left, has a red air sac, as I mentioned before. In the map down below, you can see the extent of its historical range is going to be basically that light green color there. Historically, they're found in southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. And then in the dark green, that is fairly close to what their estimated occupied range is right now. As you can see, their population has been greatly diminished. In the northern portion of their population, the northern kind of distinct population segment, they're listed as a federally threatened species, and in the south, they're listed as an endangered species. Then another prairie chicken species that we have is the Atwater, and this is one that is very much on the brink, and it's found on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Historically, there was a lot of like little blue stem, yellow Indian grass, grasslands down there, and unfortunately, they're down to about 10,000, 12,000 acres of viable habitat out there. And so Atwater prairie chickens are only found in two locations. The population is under 200 birds in the wild. And the crazy things that they do to keep Atwaters in existence is it's really quite depressing, actually. So there's a couple captive breeding facilities that raise the birds, and then they bring them down to pens, and they do kind of a soft release out in that water country. They have transmitters on almost every bird that's out there in the wild, and when a hen lays a nest, often they'll take a cage and they actually place the cage over the Atwater's habitat or their nest. And then they'll do insect sweeps to get bugs, and they'll toss bugs and food in for the female, but she basically can't really leave her nest. But they're trying to protect the nest from predation. And then when the brood hatches, they take this cage and they move it around every day, and they throw bugs in the cage that they catch locally there, and feed the Atwaters. There's a lot of issues for this species, but for the biggest one is just simply that there's just not much habitat that's left, and that's unfortunately the story for all of our prairie grouse. And then the greater prairie chicken of the prairie chicken species, they are doing by far the best. But still, when you look at the range map there in the dark blue, you can see the historic range versus the current range. It's not a good story either. Fortunately, in northeast Colorado, the bird's doing quite well. Nebraska and northeast Colorado is kind of a really good story. Over the last 20 years, we've seen massive expansion, and the birds are doing fairly well. In fact, they're actually working their way down to our neck of the woods, where we even have birds as far greater prairie chicken showing up as far south as Kiowa County in our lesser prairie chicken country. So as Henry mentioned before, lesser prairie chickens are a lekking species. So a lekking species is one where the males come out to a kind of a designated breeding location year after year after year. We've documented some, a couple leks being active upwards of 30 years. We have one lek that we actually documented being active in Colorado for 53 years. Sometimes leks will move around. Sometimes they'll just show up for 1 year. But for the most part, most of our leks, if the habitat is good around that lek, they stick around for a long time. And those males, they basically start showing up about mid to end of February and display on the lek every morning. And they'll be on that lek every morning and most evenings all the way till the 1st of June. I'll show, or I'll try to play. Hopefully it works for you. Um, some prairie chicken sounds. I don't know, Henry, is that coming through? Can you guys hear that?
I'm not hearing it right now, but it might be even better to just leave that mystique, and then when people come out to visit the Lex at some point, then they'll hear it in the flesh for the first time. But yeah, I'm not hearing it, unfortunately.
Okay. So the lesser prairie chickens again, their range is across southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, Oklahoma, panhandle of Texas, and a little bit into New Mexico. The lesser prairie chicken range has been broken up into kind of divided into four ecoregions. The sand sage ecoregion. So each ecoregion is named after its kind of primary habitat type, though birds will be found in several different habitat types within each ecoregion. But the sand sage ecoregion, that's the bulk of our Colorado lesser prairie chicken habitat. And then it is also found a little bit there in southwest Kansas. The shortgrass CRP ecoregion is mostly in Kansas, a little bit into Colorado there. Primary habitat types are CRP grasslands, and they'll use some shortgrass habitat there too, though it's shortgrass that has significantly more cover on it than most of the shortgrass that you have in Colorado. And then the mixed grass ecoregion in kind of south central Kansas, a little bit of the Oklahoma panhandle, Texas panhandle, and then the sand shinnery ecoregion where shinnery oak is one of the primary species that those birds will live in there. So we're going to be focusing really on the sand sage ecoregion this evening, talking a little bit about the shortgrass ecoregion. So this is a picture of some sand sage habitat. There's some sand sage in there, and then a whole bunch of annual buckwheat and some evening star, some manzelia, some other stuff in there. There's a lot of forbs and different types of grasses that will grow within the sand sage rangeland. But for a long time, for several decades, the only lesser prairie chickens that could be found in Colorado were in the sand sage rangeland. That's kind of changed quite a bit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But here in Colorado and then in south west Kansas, you also find them in CRP grasslands. CRP is basically it's farmland that's been enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program. The Conservation Reserve Program is a USDA program through the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Farm Service Agency, where basically farmers are paid to keep their farm ground into grasslands for periods of time. In most cases, it's under 10-year contracts, but we have a lot of CRP that's been in grass now for 30, 35 years. And it really, a lot of the CRP historically didn't get grazed much, and it really provided some very consistent, dependable nesting habitat for lesser prairie chickens. And so they've really expanded in recent decades, have expanded their range in some areas and really take advantage of this habitat. So we're going to park here on this slide a little bit. Just there's a lot to go over here, but I just kind of want to give you kind of the history of lesser prairie chickens in southeast Colorado and southwest Kansas and that San Sage ecoregion. Historically, European settlement, there were lesser prairie chickens were very quite abundant. The first kind of shot across the bow, really kind of knocking these birds back, was market hunting. Where out of southeast Colorado alone, tens of thousands, if not even more, lesser prairie chickens were harvested, and they were loaded on train cars in Colorado Springs and Denver and sent out to the eastern seaboard and sold there. That definitely hurt populations of lesser prairie chickens, but it wasn't enough to really, actually like take them out. In fact, there were some things that came a little bit later that actually helped lesser prairie chickens out a bit. But just to give us kind of some historical perspective, I'm going to read a couple of little excerpts out of a book that it's a really good read. It's was published in the late 1930s, early 1940s. It's Life Histories of North American Gallinaceous Birds by Arthur Cleveland Bent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basically back in the late 1930s what they thought was the extent of the, or I guess this is the early 1930s, the extent of the Lesser Prairie Chicken range. So here, Cleveland Bent, Arthur Cleveland Bent says the range in its entirety would probably cover no greater than a fourth of the state of Kansas. And the most abundant nucleus is in Stevens and Morton counties. So Morton County is the county immediately to the east. So it's a Kansas County immediately to the east of Baca County, Colorado. And the next county to the east of that is Stevens County. So they are listing basically the Kansas Colorado borders being the epicenter for lesser prairie chickens at the time. Here they are quite plentiful in its sandhill and bunchgrass fastness, where in the fall of the year they sometimes gather in flocks of several hundred birds, roaming where they will, a typical bird of the long grass country. So in this book, Cleveland Bent goes on to, he has some accounts from this guy named Mr. Colvin, I think John Colvin, from 1914 and 1927. So I'm going to read a little bit about a little bit of a story here that Mr. Colvin's accounts from 1914. So this is going to be right on the actually the Oklahoma-Kansas border, right on the Morton County line, so very close to Baca County, Colorado. 2 miles further along, we came to Ed Ward's. He informed us that there, sorry, let me back up. Judged from Mr. Colvin's published accounts in 1914, the lesser prairie chicken must be a fine game bird, sufficiently wild and swift of wing to make sporty shooting, and large and plump enough to make a desirable table bird. These birds were wonderfully abundant in the early days, as a few quotations from Mr. Colvin's writings will show. In a cane field near the state line, now this would have been a precursor to Milo, he says, we saw a flock of 500 or more, and when they arose, it seemed that a hole had been rent in the earth. He wanted to stop and shoot a few, but his companion urged him on, saying, those are only rovers. I'll show you some chickens when we get up in the state, so up into Kansas. Evidently, he made good, for Mr. Colvin writes, 2 miles further along, we came to Edwards. He informed us that there were a few chickens in a cane and kaffir cornfield a quarter of a mile east. We flushed several birds from the tall bunch grass just before we reached the field, which were promptly dispatched. However, in the field, things became a little bit more lively. Such a sight I have never seen before nor since. Chickens were flushing everywhere, and droves of 50 to 100 would take down the corn rows, sounding like a moving avalanche as they touched the blades of corn. Still, birds were quite wary, and the only good shots were to be had over a dog. As we thrashed back and forth across the grain field, the chickens arose in flocks of 50 to 500, and generally 60 to 80 yards distance, making shooting difficult. The majority of the birds, after being flushed, would fly back into the field, while some would go to the bunch grass covered hills half a mile away. Mr. Ward and I estimated that there were from 3,500 to 4,000 chickens in this one field, a sight never to be forgotten. He goes on later on to talk about then in 1915, the next year, his brother was on the Stevens Morton County line and went into a kaffir cornfield where they estimated between 10 and 14,000 lesser prairie chickens in one field. To put that into perspective, the total estimated population for lesser prairie chickens now, which, well, as of a few years ago, and it's probably lower now, was 32,000 birds. So obviously, at one point in time, we are in a very, very different situation, and eastern Colorado was very much sort of the epicenter for lesser prairie chickens. So I talked a little bit about the market hunting. Then we went on to kind of the next strike against them was with the uh, with the Homesteading Act of 1863. You started seeing, westward expansion, homesteading through a lot of this country, where almost the entire landscape was broken up into quarter sections. Folks would bring their oxen, their cattle, their horses, whatever they brought their cart with, and they would graze basically their entire quarter section of ground. So you have a lot of areas of shortgrass prairie that was sufficient habitat or height of grass for prairie chickens, but just that year-round grazing pattern was a big shift, and you lost a lot of habitat that way. But even worse than that was then with the plow, where the vast majority of the ground was plowed out. And then that led to the Dust Bowl that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with in the 1930s, in the Dirty 30s, where basically it was everything suffered. And the majority of folks in Southeast Colorado, Southwest Kansas had to move out because there's no way that they'd be able to make a living there. And basically, the only place where prairie chickens still could find some habitat, a little bit of a safe harbor, was in the sand sage habitat, because a lot of the sand sage country was about the only stuff that wasn't plowed out. And they didn't do well there. And in Colorado, didn't matter, sand sage or whatever habitat, they were actually extirpated in Colorado from the Dust Bowl. So by 1940, we had zero lesser prairie chickens known in the state of Colorado, and they were barely hanging on in the sand sage ecoregion in Kansas. Again, the sand sage was the only place where they had sanctuary, but they actually started to recover really actually quite well. From the 1940s to 1985, the population kind of skyrocketed to the point where in the sand sage ecoregion, there was an estimated 80,000 lesser prairie chickens from the mid 1970s to the mid 1980s. That ecoregion at the time was considered by far the best prairie chicken habitat with the most birds. And so folks out of the other ecoregions were looking at the sand sage as the primo chicken stuff. Unfortunately, though, by the mid 80s, we started seeing a whole bunch of that sand sage habitat that was kind of the sanctuary for the chickens where they had recovered, started getting plowed out with the advent of center pivot irrigation, where they started putting in a lot of wells. We lost a lot of habitat in our sand sage. And then you had a whole bunch of oil and gas development, especially the eastern part of the Sand Sage ecoregion around Garden City, Kansas, kind of from Garden City, Kansas, almost to the Colorado-Kansas border. So there was a lot of between oil and gas and a lot of center pivot irrigation. We lost those chickens, they went on a downward trajectory, going from about 80,000 prairie chickens in the mid 80s to by about 2010, 2011, estimated about 10,000 prairie chickens. Then in Colorado and a little bit into Kansas, we had a massive blizzard, the 0607 blizzard. Some folks on this call may actually remember that storm. We received 42 to 48 inches of snow on the level. We had snow drifts that were 20 foot tall. Basically started snowing the last couple of days of 2006, the first 2, 3 days of 2007. And it never got above freezing for about 2 months there. It took about 2.5 months for that snow to finally burn off. So it wiped out the majority of our chickens in Colorado. They became extirpated in a lot of our sand sage habitat. And unfortunately, there in Kansas, you didn't have to go too far over where the snow was more of an ice storm and rain. So they didn't lose as many birds. But then on the heels of that, we had year after year after year of drought. After that snowstorm, we received very little in the way of moisture for a lot of years. In fact, in an 18-year period of time, 15 of the 18 years we were in D2 drought, or excuse me, D1 drought or worse during the primary nesting season. So it was just kind of hit its worst in 2011 through 2013, where in Southwest Kansas and Southeast Colorado, we had a record-setting drought that was actually drier than it was during the Dust Bowl. And that basically led to the point where we bottomed out in Colorado at in 2016 because of those events. We made it down to an estimated 25 lesser prairie chicken males. That's all the way from the Lincoln County, Cheyenne County border on a lek, all the way to extreme southeast Baca County, south of the Cimarron River. So we had a few scattered leks with very, very few birds on them. And we went from in the sand sage ecoregion as a whole from about 10,000 birds estimated to less than 200 birds. So very much on the brink. So again, this just talking about the Dust Bowl, stepping back. This map shows Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. The lesser prairie chicken range shown there in the dotted line is the historical range. And you can see basically the time periods with the most significant, hardest hit drought. And that lined up right over that Baca County, Morton County, Kansas area where, it was the epicenter of lesser prairie chickens prior to the Dust Bowl. So where are we at now and what's going on nowadays? Well, in 2023, the lesser prairie chicken became listed as a threatened species in the northern population area. So that would include everything in Colorado. Unfortunately, that listing is kind of in threat. The listing, there's a lot of things going on with a couple court cases and even some legislation that's in the Senate right now. Don't know what's going to happen there, but there is a fairly good chance that the bird will get delisted again. The bird was actually listed as a threatened species in 2014, but that ruling was vacated by a judge's ruling down in Texas. And we may be in the same situation now, but currently they are listed as a threatened species. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we've been doing some intensive surveys for a long time. Really been the first lesser chicken lek post Dust Bowl showed up in 1953. We've done some surveying 1953 to 1974, but since 1974 on, we've surveyed every single year on a pretty intensive survey. For instance, here on the map, shown in purple, let's see, the dark purple, that's the estimated occupied range of the birds. And then all the purple kind of dots on there, That is all the areas that we've surveyed. So that's what we covered through our survey efforts this year alone with 1,225 survey points. So several people get involved in that, and for about 2.5 months, every single morning, if it's not too windy, I'm out, as well as some of the folks that work with me. This year, we found 82 males in Colorado across 15 leks. 59 of those males were in the sand sage ecoregion. So right now, I think we counted somewhere around 200 males this year in the sand sage ecoregion as a whole. So what are some of the current faces, or current challenges that these birds are facing? I talked to you a little bit about this the historic issues, but we have some stuff right now that's kind of unprecedented for these birds. One of them is with CRP, so I talked about CRP before, that crop to grass conversion work. That's been a real boon for the lesser prairie chicken. In fact, in the shortgrass ecoregion, if you remember that was the green blob on the map I showed earlier, all up in Kansas. That is an area that historically, on historic range maps, doesn't even show up as lesser prairie chicken habitat. What happened in that area is you had an area that was shortgrass prairie. A lot of it was plowed out and farmed. The shortgrass habitat that was up there was not enough. It kind of provided some habitat, but it didn't provide that consistent nesting habitat. So in the mid 1980s, when CRP hit the scene and they put a whole bunch of CRP up there, um, in less than 10 years, the lesser prairie chicken population went from pretty much non-existent up there to being the highest density of lesser prairie chickens anywhere in the range. So by the early 2000s, the shortgrass ecoregion was holding the bulk of the birds. And currently, of the 32,000 birds estimated, that shortgrass CRP ecoregion is holding about 25,000 to 27,000 of those birds. The thing is they're highly, highly dependent on CRP up there for their habitat. That's their consistent nesting habitat. Well, CRP is basically governed by the Farm Bill, and the current Farm Bill that we're under is the 2018 Farm Bill. And unfortunately, the 2018 Farm Bill saw a lot of changes. One of them is we went from this program where CRP was grazed very infrequently. Every once in a while, like maybe once in every 10 years, twice every 10 years, a field might get grazed under an emergency hanger grazing order, but those did not happen very often. Under the current 2018 Farm Bill, though, these CRP fields can be grazed under emergency haying and grazing any time that a county hits D2 drought or worse. The thing is, though, is even in the wettest of years, so like this is a spectacular year. We're getting a lot of really good moisture. I think we'll see really good production this year for prairie chickens. Grass is growing fast. It's a good year. But in a couple of the counties around here, we hit D2 drought, so that automatically triggers grazing. Additionally, the 2018 Farm Bill allows for managed grazing every other year if the landowner is willing to take a little pay cut. And then, for mid-contract management, grazing is a pretty common thing as well. So now you have CRP that used to get grazed, not at all. And when grazing occurred, it was some of the fields on the landscape, not all. Now we're starting to see is basically grazing occurring every year to every other year. And in some places, like in Hamilton County, Kansas, just across the border, for instance, I'd found 7 prairie chicken leks in the last 5 years in CRP. Really good, healthy leks, good number of birds, the type of leks you'd imagine would stick around for 20, 30, 40 years. All in one year, I go out there a couple of years ago, and all the CRP, as far as the eye could see, was all grazed off. There was no habitat. We just lost it completely, and those leks disappeared. And it's no small thing getting those leks established in the first place. Additionally, CRP doesn't pay nearly as much as it used to. In fact, landowners are getting paid the same or less than they were 30 years ago, and that just doesn't work. So we're seeing a massive amount of CRP plow out. So right now, currently, all this habitat that we're depending on for prairie chickens is all in threat. In fact, in Colorado, since 2018, all of our lesser prairie chicken leks have been in CRP, or the birds are depending on CRP. Finally, this year, we had one lek show up in rangeland again. But with the way CRP is going, things are looking pretty dire in Colorado and in most of the Kansas habitat. Something else that we're facing is a lot of energy development. So lesser prairie chickens are a species of the southern Great Plains where historically you have little to no like trees out on the landscapes, pretty much just grasslands. It's a drier part of the Great Plains. And those lesser prairie chickens have very much adapted to a landscape without any trees. And lesser prairie chicken hens associate tall structures with predators. Any tree that you get on the landscape may have a nest on it or a perching raptor. Something like a power line may be a place for raptors to perch. So prairie chickens, but especially lesser prairie chicken hens, avoid tall structures on the landscape. So if you go into an area with a whole bunch of wind towers, for instance, on a big wind project, almost instantly those birds will vacate that area. Unfortunately, here in Colorado, unfortunately for the prairie chicken at least, here in Colorado, there's about 14 planned planned wind projects in lesser prairie chicken habitat with I don't even know how many 20 plus solar projects in lesser prairie chicken habitat. We're getting new solar projects coming down the line constantly. We had the Excel Power Pathway is a big transmission line that is currently being built. Several segments have already been built. It's gone right by a couple of our lesser prairie chicken leks. This year, it's going to be built across another one of our lesser prairie chicken leks, the only lek we have in Kiowa County. So that transmission line is going to be a really big hit. But greater than that is all the wind towers that are going to go in, and the wind projects are going to go in because now the transmission is there. So that is potentially could be the nail in the coffin for our birds. It's really not looking good. I'll talk a little bit more about a silver lining here in a minute. There is a little bit of hope with some of this stuff. So we'll see how this all shakes out. But what now? When we're facing all of these things, what do we as a wildlife agency, what do partners like Southern Plains Land Trust and Pheasants Forever, the Nature Conservancy, what are the things that we're working on to try to help these birds? One of the first things that folks often bring up is if your bird numbers are doing real poorly and they were taken out by blizzards and drought, this, that, and the other, is why not try translocation? Well, one of the problems with translocation is unless you fix the things that are impacting the habitat negatively for chickens, unless you change those and have proper habitat, then it really doesn't make sense to do any kind of translocation project. But we had looked at some of the habitat that we had on the Comanche National Grasslands and the Cimarron National Grasslands, and honestly, at least through my prairie chicken glasses, it really looks like very good prairie chicken habitat. So we did actually embark on here in just recent years a significant translocation project, moving lesser prairie chickens into the Comanche National Grasslands and the Cimarron National Grasslands. So basically, we caught birds in the shortgrass CRP ecoregion to the northeast there, and we moved them into the sand sage brush prairie and of the Comanche grasslands and the Cimarron National Grasslands shown there on the map. So as we were looking at this project, there had been some translocations of lesser prairie chickens done previously, and one of the big reasons for us to do this project was even to assess to see if it is a viable tool in the toolbox. Well, there had been some translocations done before, but most of them were very small scale, moving just a small handful of individuals. The largest translocation project that had ever been done prior to the one we had done just recently on the Comanche and the Cimarron was taking birds from the Garden City, Kansas area and the Comanche and taking them out towards Pueblo, Colorado. Historically, I don't know if you noticed there on the maps, but for Colorado, the lesser prairie chicken range historically extended all the way to the Front Range, all the way up to Pueblo. So there's an area around the Pueblo test track site where it looked like there was sufficient habitat for lesser prairie chickens. So about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, there's a translocation project that occurred where about 60 lesser prairie chickens were moved over 4 years out to the Pueblo test track site. Now, it's very, very difficult to catch lesser prairie chicken hens because those males for about 2.5 months, they're on a lek every single morning. The females, they only show up on a lek 1, 2, maybe 3 mornings during the entire season. And so you have very small opportunities to try to catch those hens. And they did catch, fair number of birds, but about, of 60, 65 birds or whatnot they moved, only about 20 of them were lesser prairie chicken hens. So at the end of the day, they just didn't move enough birds for it to be successful. Also, there was very little follow-up on it. They put transmitters on some birds, but I don't think they realized how much those birds would move. And so they didn't try to track those birds with an airplane, which we discovered is essential. And the GPS technology just wasn't around at that time. But all those lesser prairie chickens were banded. And this is really important, and this is definitely one of our concerns on our more modern translocation project was in a year after they did the bigger release there at the Pueblo Test Track site, there was a prairie chicken hunter in Kansas. This is when you still could harvest prairie chickens legally in Kansas. And they were only about 4 or 5 miles from where some of these prairie chickens had been captured. And he harvested a lesser prairie chicken with a band on it that had traveled 200 miles from Pueblo all the way back to where it had been captured. The reality is leks are kind of the center of the universe for these birds, especially for the males. So when we were going into our Comanche and Cimarron translocation project, we didn't know if all those birds would go ahead and return back up to where we captured them from. We didn't know whether they would nest. We didn't know how it would go at all. So it was definitely um, something that we wanted to learn a lot on. And so we actually pulled in, we had 4 different graduate students on the project. It was a very large 4-year project. A lot was put into it. 4 years of my life. That was most of what I was doing. I'm going to try playing, there's no better way to kind of show you what we were doing with that translocation than play a video. And I kind of suspect this might not work. So Henry, if you could chime in, I'm going to start it up. And if you guys can't hear it, then Henry, just let me know that it's not working. We'll skip on to the next slide. But I would recommend
That's
you
good.
then later on to go ahead and check this out. It's on YouTube. Just, type in and search, Lesser Prairie Chicken, CPW or something like that. So I'll get it started here. We'll see if you guys can hear it.
No, we're not hearing it.
Okay, give
You
me
could
just
try
one
to
one
unshare your
second here.
screen and reshare, Jonathan, and then click share sound.
Yeah, I
There's like a
will.
little a
Yep.
little box, but currently not
I'm
hearing
gonna
it.
switch things up here. First off, I'm gonna do that. All right, got it. Let's try this.
Yep, hearing that just fine.
Cool. Is the video showing?
Yep.
We're in Scott Lake, Kansas, here at our grouse camp. We're on a lesser prairie chicken translocation project where we're trying to trap lesser prairie chickens so that we can bring them down to southeastern Colorado onto the Comanche National Grasslands and southwestern Kansas onto the Cimarron National Grasslands, where we're trying to recover the population of those species. Just 3 years ago, we were looking at probably less than 50 lesser prairie chickens in the state of Colorado. So the situation for the lesser prairie chicken in our state has become rather dire, and hence this project. We've been trapping prairie chickens now for 3 years. We started in the fall of 2016. We're trapping prairie chickens on leks. Leks are the breeding grounds for lesser prairie chickens. Several grouse species have lekking behavior where they all get together on breeding grounds. The males display. The lek is really a fun thing to watch, all that lekking behavior. The birds are fighting, they're booming and chasing each other around. Lesser prairie chickens make some really crazy sounds. If you ever have the opportunity to watch lesser prairie chickens, I really highly recommend it. I'm kind of biased here, but I think that they're the most interesting of the grouse species and most enjoyable to watch on the lek. So every morning we're trapping these leks. We use 2 different techniques to try to trap these lesser prairie chickens. We have walk-in funnel traps that are 3 foot long by 2 foot tall wire traps that we don't bait them. They just have a wire funnel that goes into the trap, just kind of like a minnow trap or a fish trap. Another way that we trap lesser prairie chickens is we use drop nets. Looks kind of like a circus tent out there on the prairie when we're trapping, and you set that right over the main part of the lek where the dominant males are, hoping to catch the females as they're coming in. Most of the folks that are trapping are in blinds, and so they'll jump out of the blind and you race to the net as fast as you can. You work that bird out and you put it in a pillowcase, and then once we catch those birds and we have them in hand, we load them up in our trucks and put the air conditioning on. We want to keep those birds cool. It seems to reduce their stress. We head to the cabin at Scott Lake and we take a series of measurements on them. We weigh them. We measure some measurements on their heads and their legs, on their wings. Basically, we're looking at some morphometric data. We also, on quite a few birds that we've taken, we've drawn blood, we've taken mouth swab samples because we want to do some disease testing. Because we want to make sure that the birds that we're moving into Colorado and down to Elkhart area in Kansas, that they're healthy and that we're not transporting any diseases into another grouse population or affecting any other wildlife. So while processing the birds, we put a transmitter on every single bird. We want to be able to track their movements and see where they go. Especially for the hens, we want to be able to determine if they're successful at nesting and see where they nest. That's going to help us because we'll be able to learn more about the habitat that they're selecting for nesting, so we can make sure that we can put more habitat and work to get more habitat like that on the ground. Colorado Parks and Wildlife is committed to try to recover and restore endangered and threatened species in the state. So we're doing this project to try to recover one of Colorado's most, I think, iconic grouse species. You know, it's a species that is very much native to Southeast Colorado. It's a part of Southeast Colorado's history and a favorite animal for a lot of people.
All right, I'm just gonna get back to presentation.
I have to admit, Jonathan, the slide that you did there to get that chicken out of the net was really impressive. I have to give you kudos for that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good that the video actually came through. The whole time I was wondering if you guys are just getting the audio. So uh I figure I could tell you about it, but the video really is a better way to do it. So uh I don't know why. Oh, there we go. Okay. All I'm seeing on my screen it says Henry Pollock. So are you guys seeing
We
the
can see your
PowerPoint?
slides, Jonathan. We can see
Okay.
your
All right.
slides.
Good deal. Okay. So bear with me for a second. Yeah, so basically is a one heck of a project. Every morning we started at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. Everybody went about an hour and a half off different directions. Our center of operations was Scott Lake, Kansas, and over the course of mostly over 3 springs, we actually successfully captured 411 lesser prairie chickens, translocated them down to the Cimarron and the Comanche. So definitely much, much greater effort than had ever been done before. We had, like I said, a lot that went into this whole project. Um, from a daggone, there we go. A lot went into this project from a research standpoint. We wanted to not only, know basically the success of the birds, but we wanted to basically assess the habitat that they were utilizing. In order to track the birds, every single bird had a transmitter on it. Some of the hens had GPS transmitters, but most of them had VHF transmitters. And here we learned very quickly the only way to track them with the VHF transmitters is we had to get an airplane up in the sky because when you first would release these birds, they would make some major, major movements, as I'll show here in a second. But we collected a ridiculous amount of edge data and learned a lot about what these birds were selecting for and where they ended up. So I'm going to go. There we go. So this screen that's up right now, it's kind of hard to see, but basically uh, you have southeast Colorado here, you have southwest Kansas, and then Oklahoma. You can pick out Boise City, Elkhart, and then Johnson City, Kansas. In green is the Comanche National Grasslands and the Cimarron Grasslands. What I'm going to do when I start this up, you're gonna see colors show up. And what it's going to do is going to show you basically what each bird was doing as we were releasing them. So these are hens that we release with GPS transmitters, but it's good to kind of study basically the scale of this is a very, very large landscape. In fact, we even catch the Texas Panhandle on the north end there, and we barely just miss the Arkansas River up to the north. See if I can get it to go. So when we released birds, most of them kind of did the same thing. They'd spend 2 or 3 days to kind of acclimate to their transmitter, acclimate to the area, and then they would start just moving out in kind of these like some of them did these large concentric rings that just ever widening, and they would start taking off. And basically, these hens were just kind of mapping out the landscape. We had hens that were released there by the Oklahoma Colorado border by Campo, Colorado, make it all the way up to the Arkansas River and back. We had birds that were released on the Baca County site make it all the way over to the Elkhart site, 45 miles away and vice versa. So Kansas released birds, made it to Colorado and nested, and vice versa. We had birds make it all the way down to Texas. Um, a lot of these birds, you'd release them and they would travel about 1,000 kilometers or more for about 3 weeks. And then they finally would settle down and they would come back to some lek that they found on their journeys. In most cases, they were leks that the translocated males had set up. But if there was any active lek before we did this project that still existed all the way up to the Arkansas River, these birds would find it. So they're not moving much right now. Those are actually those birds then nesting. And then when you'll occasionally see a bird all of a sudden make a big movement, that's when a hen loses a nest and she moves on to another location. And often they'll try to re-nest on a second attempt if there's enough moisture and if the conditions are right. But some pretty major crazy movements that these birds did. Here's just an example again of three birds, each bird in different color. The one there in purple released there south of Campo. At one point in time, I actually had a collared bighorn sheep within a half a mile of this transmitter chicken. So this bird made it all the way to some of our candy country down there in southern Baca County. Again, here's a bird that made it all the way down in red down to the Texas Panhandle. Another bird there in blue that went up a couple of times, almost up to the Arkansas River, almost to Lamar, and it ended up nesting in Baca County, or excuse me, in Prowers County, southeast Prowers County, on a historical lek that we have. So one major thing that was kind of unanticipated from this project is, we were trying to get these birds reestablished in Sand Sage habitat. We captured them in the shortgrass CRP ecoregion in very different habitat type. And so we captured these birds, brought them down to the sand sage, released them thinking this is great habitat. Well, I think those birds had a really strong natal habitat preference, seeking out habitat that looked exactly like where they came from. And so almost all of our birds ended up blowing out of the Comanche grasslands, blowing out of the Cimarron grasslands and going to the north and setting up shop in CRP. The picture there in the north right, excuse me, on the top right there is the flag is actually marking a lesser prairie chicken nest there. This is a really good example of the type of habitat that those birds actually selected. More than likely, had we gotten our hands on sand sage birds from the sand sage ecoregion and released them, they probably would have stayed down in the sand sage habitat. But unfortunately, they did not, and they got established up on private lands in CRP. This kind of illustrates that. It shows kind of in the green to the south there, that's the Comanche and Cimarron National Grasslands. The blue are the historic leks. And then all the areas that I circled, that's where the vast majority of our translocated birds ended up. So they pretty much all bailed out of the sand sage, making it their way to some CRP. So let me back up on that and just talk a little bit more on the translocation. So from all of that, like what did we learn? Well, one, we learned it is possible to do this. We actually, 1 year after we finished the translocation project, so we hadn't released birds for a year. We actually had 19 or 20 lesser prairie chicken leks, and we had over, I think that video said 109, but it's actually 115 males that we documented on 20 prairie chicken leks. And the vast majority of those birds were birds that were raised in those areas where we released them. So they weren't the actual birds we released, they were offspring of the birds that we had released. So things were tracking and looking very, very good. But unfortunately, then we hit 3 years of gnarly, gnarly drought. In fact, for 2 of the 3 years, the driest spot in all of Kansas and the driest spot in all of Colorado was right there on the Comanche and the Cimarron area. So those birds for about 3 years then didn't get much in the way of production, and it knocked our bird numbers back. We still have a couple of active leks in Baca County and maybe half a dozen leks in Kansas there. Unfortunately, these birds just really aren't doing well. The reality is we probably would have had to have moved even far more birds to do this. And there's a lot of challenges in that we're taking birds away from some other area where they're doing well. And when the birds are threatened, like this becomes a very like complicated situation politically. It becomes logistically complicated. It's just a hard thing to do. We very well may consider translocation in the future. There's just going to be a lot of hoops that we're going to have to jump through. But it was proven to be kind of a viable tool in the toolbox. So what are we doing now? So historically, for a long time, we've been working a lot on lesser prairie chicken habitat. When I say we, it's Colorado Parks and Wildlife, it's U.S. Department of Agriculture programs through NRCS and the Farm Service Agency, organizations like Southern Plains Land Trust, are folks, like there's a lot of folks have been doing a lot of work across chicken country, but the problem is it's been scattered across chicken country. And we've been focusing it around these scattered leks. We've kind of taken a step back though and really realized when we're looking at what we're going to see here for wind development and solar development is we really need to pick a focal area to put more of our eggs in fewer baskets. And so this slide here is showing basically the sand sage generational grasslands stronghold area. It's an area that we've identified as a focus area. So it's there in eastern Prowers County, Colorado, and then mostly in Hamilton County, Kansas. You can see there in yellow is the active leks and the red is historic leks. So most of our work in Colorado right now, we're focusing just across the border from where the bulk of the birds are. I surveyed that stuff just barely into Colorado, and within 7 miles of the Colorado border, I counted almost 300 lesser prairie chickens this year. Not all of those were males. There's a fair number of females in there too, but definitely saw a pretty big bump of birds there. So we have good source population, but this is where we're focusing all of our efforts now. One of the things Colorado Parks and Wildlife has been working a lot on is with landowner outreach. The reality is this is a private land species. There's very little public land this bird can be found on. And so it all starts with relationships. And one of the things that we've been doing quite a bit the last couple of years, working in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, has been conducting landowner surveys. They're pretty informal surveys. Basically, if they're farmers, we're trying to figure out if they have any interest in their farm ground going to grass. If so, what would that cost? If they have rangeland, would they be interested in their rangeland not getting grazed or something being done where it's less cattle on, if it's being, managed a little bit more, a little bit better for prairie chickens? Well, what would that cost for them to basically be paid for that ecosystem service? Something else that we're doing is we're actively pursuing ranches and projects and pastures. We're paying for grazing deferment. We've really seen some awesome success here. And earlier I'd mentioned that we have once again finally a lek. All our leks last several years have been just in CRP. Just this year we have one in rangeland, and that's on a property where we're paying the landowner not to graze it. And in one single year of it not getting grazed, boom, we popped a lek in that ground. But conservation easements, grassland protection, trying to basically find ways to fund better management of grasslands that are out there. And then Colorado Parks and Wildlife does a lot of grass drilling, a lot of crop to grass work. We've got, I've got a couple of tractors and a couple of grass drills and dedicated year-round staff that works on this kind of stuff. We work a lot with NRCS and FSA, Pheasants Forever, and other partners. But we put in thousands of acres of grass every single year trying to create more CRP, more prairie chicken habitat. And then something that is giving me kind of more hope than anything else is I told you before I would talk about the silver lining of some of the energy development that we're seeing. And that silver lining comes in the form of mitigation. Because the lesser prairie chicken is listed as a threatened species, legally for these wind companies to develop in lesser prairie chicken country or solar or transmission lines getting built or oil and gas, they basically have to buy mitigation credits. And the way that it works is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has identified for every structure on the landscape a certain impact radius or impact distance that any habitat within that impact radius that's impacted, they have to mitigate for. So for instance, for a wind tower, it's 1,800 meters from that wind tower. Any grassland field that's prairie chicken habitat, that's considered impacted acreage. So it needs to be mitigated with a 1-to-2 ratio. So for every 1 acre impacted, you need to come up with 1 acre of preservation and 1 acre of restoration. The preservation basically means going into places that's like sand, sage, rangeland, land and you put a conservation easement on it so it can't get developed, it can't get wind towers on it. And then also there's stipulations that it gets actually managed for prairie chicken habitat and properly managed. So you do get some uplift there. And then what I'm really excited about is also this restoration work. And in Colorado, what that means is taking cropland and putting it to grass. So basically be the equivalent of CRP, except this grass is going to stay in grass in perpetuity. Whereas a CRP, it's 10-year, 15-year contracts, and a lot of that we're seeing getting plowed out. So just as Henry had mentioned before, we're really focusing on this sand sage generational grassland stronghold. We're hoping to build a couple kind of strongholds in that area and try to basically have these 50,000 acre blocks of perpetually protected habitat. And that's where organizations like Southern Plains Land Trust are a huge, huge ally in that, we can have a lot of programs where we're finding money for incentives like with CRP or whatnot, but that's not a stable foundation to build on. We really need to build some protected lands, some blocks of habitat that are managed specifically for chickens. And I know Southern Plains Land Trust is a partner that is super interested in getting involved in trying to help acquire lands, fee title purchase of lands, management of lands, co-management of lands for lesser prairie chickens. I think if we're really going to change things for these birds and we're really gonna make a difference, we have to really create these areas that are managed with prairie chickens in mind above all else. If we don't do that, we are going to lose these birds. We truly are on the brink now, and the reality is we're one nasty blizzard or multi-year drought away from extirpation in the sand sage ecoregion as a whole. And when I first started working on this species, I never thought it was possible that these birds would actually become extinct. I thought surely, there's so many birds, yeah, extirpated in some areas or whatnot, but the more and more I work with the bird, the more I clearly see there's a very clear and fairly likely path to extinction here. So it's really, really important if we're going to save this bird, we need to get a lot more active. We need to do a lot more, be a lot more aggressive. And so there's a lot more support. We have more partners, and there's a lot more support within in my agency to acquire properties. Also, this mitigation work, if that happens, that really could change things and move the needle significantly there. Unfortunately, if the lesser prairie chicken becomes delisted, then these wind companies are not required to do the mitigation. And so it's possible that we could see all the impacts without actually seeing the offsets by having good habitat established. So the crystal ball is a little fuzzy on what's going to happen the next few years. Um, but I can tell you there's a lot of people that are committed on it. Henry is very, very excited and interested and is doing a lot of work behind the scenes trying to get something going for lesser prairie chickens in this stronghold. So my hat's off to Southern Plains Land Trust and all the work that they've been doing as they are such a phenomenal partner, one of our biggest and most important partners in prairie chicken conservation. So with that, I'll take any questions that anybody has.
All righty. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was phenomenal. It's funny. I've heard Jonathan talk about prairie chickens a handful of times now, and I think I learn new things every time. And I think it's pretty clear from his presentation that he has a deep knowledge of the species, and I think that's why we should all be scared about the future of the species and be prioritizing it. And just really briefly, it's interesting to think about from my perspective as the director of Split. What are our priorities at Split? What land do we want to buy? What's important to our organization? And, when I started at Split a year and a half ago, I think I had different ideas and I think my thoughts have evolved. And right now, I think we're really, really centrally focused on lesser prairie chickens right now, because as Jonathan mentioned, this is the species in greatest danger of extinction on the Southern Plains with regard to birds. It's been hit by wave after wave of human impacts over the last 100 or more years, and we're in a critical time right now. So it's the reason why our spring campaign this year is focused on prairie chickens, and hopefully, we'll see what happens. But in the next couple of months, I've been working on a couple of different properties trying to gain some ground for prairie chickens and give them. You really need to manage this land to specifically for chickens. If you are grazing it in ways that are traditionally done in our area, as Jonathan mentioned, it's just not going to work out for them. So, anyways, with that, we have some questions in the chat that I can field, and if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we can get a quick round of questions in here. We can start at the beginning, Jonathan. Zach said, "Is it possible to see an Atwater's prairie chicken for the general public? Do you know anything about that situation down in Texas?"
So I I don't know. I have talked to people that have seen Atwaters. I know that it's possible to do like a visit on the at the captive rearing facilities. Like I visited the birds there at Sutton Avian Research Institute. They hold one of the captive populations birds. I really don't know the situation for Atwaters, but I will speak to the situation for lesser prairie chickens in viewing. The reality is the birds, like we used to have public viewing blinds in Baca County. It's free of charge. You go to the public viewing blind on the Comanche Grasslands. We had a tourism outfit, that was based out of Holly that they were getting onto Lex. The Cimarron Grasslands had one. Down at Milnesan, New Mexico, there's a Prairie Chicken Festival. There was, Oklahoma had a Prairie Chicken Festival. They've all been canceled. Everything is closed. Everything is canceled. There is next to nothing as far as public viewing opportunities. The one single viewing opportunity that exists, let me go to this next slide here, is basically in the shortgrass CRP ecoregion. Kansas Wildlife and Parks and Tourism has partnered with I think Oakley area tourism out of Oakley, Kansas, and some partners there. Where basically there are about 3, 4 different ranches they run tours on. My understanding is usually they're about 2, 3 years booked in advance. So if you do want to see a lesser prairie chicken, this is a number you're going to want to call or try to reserve for 2, 3 years from now. There are some places that, you can contact me. I can circle places for you on a map or whatnot, where even from county roads, you stand a reasonable chance of finding Lex and observing Lex. But because they are a federally listed species, there's also limitations, and it's something that you could be, from a county road or whatnot, but technically it's not legal actually for somebody to go out there and set up on a lek. I'm able to do that as I'm permitted, and I'm allowed to take people out onto a lek, for the purpose of prairie chicken conservation. But there's very, very few opportunities like that. I sure hope by the end of my career, I got 10 years left, and I'm hoping in 10 years that I'll be running so I'll be up every morning still and taking people out to prairie chicken like somewhere in southeast Colorado. That is the vision and the hope. So hopefully we can get there in 10 years, but a lot needs to happen to make that happen. So
Thank you, Jonathan. And if anybody in this chat room would like to give $1 million donation to support prairie chicken land acquisition, you can get a free tour of a prairie chicken land.
I'll give you
In
several
all
tours.
seriousness,
Yeah.
that's no, that's yeah. We hope in the work that we're doing with CPW to get more chickens on the landscape, and ultimately, with Split, I think a big part of what we're doing is to try to, be able to set this up so people can come view them and appreciate just the magnificence of this species. Zach said deal. All right, Zach, we'll talk about that after the presentation. Continuing on with the questions, there's a couple more left here. Where were we at? Alex visits in the Colorado. Can the greater and lesser prairie chicken populations coexist in the same location, or is there competition?
Okay. Yeah. Excellent question. On that video that you guys were watching, and it might be something that you go find on YouTube and listen to that last little bit, right at the very end when it's like, it's music and then you can hear prairie chickens booming and all that. There is a hybrid in that's calling. So it's like, the bubbly sound of lesser prairie chickens, but then there's this like woo, woo kind of sound, and that is a hybrid there. Greater prairie chickens sound very, very different than lesser prairie chickens. So you do see in areas some hybridization. So in that shortgrass CRP ecoregion, where historically it was outside of the range for greater chickens and lesser chickens both species have shown up there. Now, lesser prairie chickens are better adapted to kind of drier areas or whatnot, and so they're doing better than the graders are there. I think about 20 years ago or so, there was some research that was done, and they're finding about 20% of the birds being greater chickens up there. Now it's more like 3 or 4% being graders. So yes, every lesser prairie chicken hen that breeds with a greater prairie chicken male produces hybrids that are functionally like that's a waste of sort of the nesting effort and offspring of a hen. Where we're seeing it is in Cheyenne County, Colorado, where we have an area where just recently, in the last like 10 years, we've seen a whole bunch of prairie chicken leks get established in CRP, where they finally have kind of moved over, got established in those areas. But simultaneously, graders and lessers did that, and they're all like real low densities. And so one grader chicken finds one lesser chicken, and they're like, hey, I haven't seen somebody that looked like me for months. Let's hang out. And most of those leks, you find lessers, graders, and hybrids on them. And so that is a definite impact to those greater chickens that, some of those greater, or excuse me, lesser chickens, those lesser chicken hens are breeding with some of the greater chickens. And that is not good. But it's a messy situation. It's not one that, there's been conversations for like, why don't you just go and remove the greater chicken males from the leks or whatnot, but it's a complicated deal. And I think it's a natural thing that's occurring too, and it's something that we don't want to pursue yet. So
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it sort of highlights how when you have small populations, the threats kind of multiply, right? So something like hybridization, which wouldn't really be a threat if the populations were stable, becomes a problem when you have this mixing of genes. Jason was asking Jonathan, are you seeing any changes, increase or decrease in producer interest in helping with prairie chickens in the areas that you worked in at all over the years?
I will say, folks that especially grew up with lesser prairie chickens in around them, that folks that are familiar with the birds, they really want to see birds back. Most of those folks have lost their birds. There is a lot of interest from producers. It's very easy, even though the bird's threatened and whatnot, and there's like, some people have the fear of the government coming in, blah, 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 blah. We are rarely ever turned down to go get onto somebody's ground to survey for prairie chickens. The problem is like these people are making their livelihood off of this land. And we are on, especially in Colorado and in the Santa Chica region, we're on the drier part of the range. And there's not a lot. If you're going to like manage as good as you possibly can for chickens, sometimes that comes into conflict with what you're trying to do agriculturally, especially with grazing. And then a farmer, they're making their cheddar off of farming, not CRP. Now, there was a lot of interest in CRP back in the day, but it paid a lot more. And that's where that program is not, it's diluted. It's not nearly what it was before. Landowners are losing interest because it's not paying them what it needs to. And there are some folks that are keeping their grass in grass just for prairie chickens and wildlife. But for most folks, they just can't make that pay. So the reality of the whole situation is it just takes more money. As interested as landowners are, since they live off of that land, they can't do it unless it pays.
I think that highlights the reason why organizations like Split are so important for the sustainable longevity of a Southeast Colorado lesser prairie chicken population. We need the land to be managed for chickens specifically and not, primarily managed first and foremost for economic benefits. Great point. Couple more questions, then we can wrap up here. Evan said, thanks for the great presentation. With the proposal to permanently delist the prairie chicken, what's the likelihood of this being successful and going through Congress? And I guess the follow-up, kind of what do you think the impacts are going to be? And I guess you mentioned a little bit about the mitigation, but
Yeah, so currently a bill. There was a Kansas senator that introduced a bill to the Senate. That bill would basically would have the listing decision for the bird be vacated, so the bird would no longer be listed. But not only that, the language in that bill stipulates that lesser chickens could no longer be covered by the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act would cover all other imperiled species in the United States except lesser prairie chickens. Now, this bill actually, a very similar bill, went through the House and the Senate a year ago. It was passed both by the House and the Senate. Then it was vetoed by Biden. In this case, because it's a second go round and for a couple other reasons, they got to get a supermajority in the Senate. So they got to have 60 votes. And it's really looking like there's no way they can get those 60 votes. So right now, of the threats of delisting, that bill is probably the least of the concerns. What's of greater concerns is there's a lawsuit by three of the prairie chicken states. Colorado's not one of those. But three of the states, Permian oil fields and a couple other entities, basically they're trying to have the bird, the listing decision get vacated. There's been some action on that. Things are not looking promising. Nothing is super clear yet. So we just don't know how it's going to work. If the bird is delisted, basically the big giant hit there is yes, for all of that mitigation work, that all goes away. It all becomes voluntary, and so you still might have like token money that comes on that. Now, meanwhile, Colorado, like we do have for oil and gas development, we have I don't forget, it was a House bill or Senate Bill 230 that passed like a year ago, and it's actually going to basically require that there's a excise tax on oil and gas that is that money gets spent on conservation work. Additionally, there needs to be mitigation work through Senate Bill, I think 180, that requires if there's any oil and gas development in Prairie Chicken country that they're going to have to mitigate for that. So there are some state protections, and that there is nothing there for like green energy type stuff. The renewables that is getting considered right now. I don't know whether that is gonna get pushed through, but there are folks that are drafting a bill to basically do the same thing to give some mitigation protections in the same way that you have for oil and gas in Colorado.
Awesome. And yeah, it sounds like a complicated situation. It's good to hear that it sounds like delisting is probably not imminent given the situation with the supermajority in the Senate, but still, I think there are definitely threats kind of bearing down the neck on this species as Jonathan has discussed. Let's do one more question and wrap up. We have from Mike Higby, it says, can you explain a little bit about the kind of the landscape context here, the kind of corridor that you mentioned between the Colorado and Kansas, the Comanche and Cimarron down there, and how we can kind of support the development of the regional and the conservation of the regional population?
Sure, you bet. Yeah, I mean, landscape is kind of everything for these birds, and as you can see by the Translocation Project movement, those birds have the ability. Now, they don't normally move like that. That's because we translocated those birds, but they have the ability to move some long distances, and that's where we were trying to focus on before we lost the birds on the Comanche and the Cimarron, because you have these large, relatively intact chunks of sand sage rangeland that are connected. There's good connectivity between the two. The thing is our bird numbers are just so poor there, and there is no good source population currently. That's why we're focusing further to the north in Prowers County, where in the sand sage habitat south of the Arkansas River in Kansas, there's just one area that's not even that big that is holding the majority of the population in the sand sage ecoregion. And so we're focusing the majority of our work just across the border in Colorado, where that'll be the source population. I mean, we have, 2 miles from the Colorado-Kansas border, there was a lack of 33 males on it this year. That is an enormous lack. Like I said, I counted over 300 birds within 7 miles of the border. So it just makes a lot of sense for us to focus on that area. Also, there are wind projects planned for that area, but that is the least likely location for these development projects to occur. If we can build this stronghold and have a protected area, then the hope is then that becomes the source population in Colorado to try to get birds back up in the Big Sandy, up in Cheyenne County and Kiowa County, to get birds back down onto the Comanche grasslands, the Cimarron grasslands. But unless we have a good source population, all is lost. So we're doing everything we can right now to kind of maintain that source population there south of the Arkansas River.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we can wrap up with that tonight, but I'll just give one last plug. For those of you who have been moved by the story that Jonathan has told you tonight, please donate. Lexi, my lovely board president, put a link in the chat. Please share with people. A lot of people have probably never heard of a lesser prairie chicken, and they are such a cool species. So please feel free to share with everyone your networks and let them know about this. And as I mentioned, Split is all in on lesser prairie chickens. This is going to be one of the main thrusts of our land acquisition moving forwards, and we're going to try to start this generational stronghold in Colorado. So thank you again, Jonathan, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We really appreciate it and hope you all have a good rest of your